Hello everyone, Sakuya here, and welcome back to another episode of the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. And on today's episode, we are going to be talking about some of the absolutely horrible things that you might have experienced in history if you somehow found yourself on the opposite side of a Mongol army. Spoiler alert, it probably did not end well for you, like at all. I mean, you have to remember that we are talking about the Mongols. These were the great nomadic horsemen of the steppes, the terror of China, the ruthless cavalry whose bows and lances would continuously seek the blood of their enemies in their continuous expansion of empire. I mean, the Mongol army was effectively the dominant force of the 13th century, though that being said, their force was never really all that large. Instead, what it is that they had done was rely on superior tactics and speed. And if possible, they would rely on terror to cow an enemy into not fighting in the first place before a battle could ever occur. And so now the following are 3 different terror tactics that the Mongols would use to reign as the undisputed masters of Asia, Europe, and the wider world. I will say this from the beginning, but war is a very messy thing, and as a result of that, having accurate knowledge about what you are going to be facing up against is really important. The Mongols were experts at making sure that that didn't happen. For instance, when they would be approaching an enemy army, what Mongol forces would typically do would be split into 3 or more possible army groups, each one trying to outflank and surprise their opponents. What would happen as a result of this is that it would create many different possible battlefields for the opponents, where the Mongols would seem to appear out of nowhere, and that there were seemingly far more of them than there were in actuality. Which, to be fair, it was quite easy for the Mongols to appear to be significantly larger and scarier than they actually were. The reason for this was that each Mongol was a horseman who in turn would have extra horses that he would take with him. These were the extra mounts that over the course of a battle or a journey would be gradually cycled out with another as the previous one would tire, which in turn would give the Mongol army an edge in speed. With a fresh mount, this means that they would continuously be able to move at relatively the same pace without having to rest their horses. But for the purpose of deceiving the enemy, it was a common tactic to have dummies and servants ride the extra horses in order to seem like they had more fighting men. Another tactic was to tie branches to rope that would then be dragged behind those horses in order to kick up extra dirt and dust into the air. By creating a storm of dust, an enemy scout that came upon the scene would swear that it would belong to a significantly greater horde of enemies that was many times the actual size of the army. And then to fuel this deception further, when the Mongols would get closer to an enemy army or settlement, they would have their soldiers light significantly more fires than they actually needed. This gave the impression that with more cook fires, there were more soldiers, and that their army was many times greater than it actually was. Thus, a smaller force of 15 to 20,000 men could appear to be as large as 80 to 100,000. At such a sight, it wasn't really uncommon for an enemy city to just outright surrender before a fight could ever occur. But that being said, when it came to the early days of sieges, fighting absolutely would occur, and it was oftentimes bloody and horrible. When the Mongols wanted to take a city in the early days of conquest, this being before they had siege engines and engineers to actually make and manage them, their method for it was rather simple, but remarkably brutal and effective, even if it took a little bit of extra time. What would first happen is that they would first attack the surrounding small villages of a settlement and drive the inhabitants as migrants and refugees towards the big city. The city, now swelled with a larger than usual population, would now gradually collapse from within, as its resources, such as food, would exhaust at a significantly quicker rate. This would save the Great Khan the effort of having to sit down for months at a time for a traditional siege, as the supplies would run out just that much quicker. Of course, during their later conquest, when they did actually have siege engines, then they were fully ready to assault the walls, but in a significantly more brutal fashion, and the fate for those refugees would be significantly worse. Instead of being merely driven towards the city, these refugees would now serve as forced labor for the Mongol army, and also as literal human shields for arrows. After seizing a city or a town or a village, the Mongols would divide the population into units of 10, and each Mongol soldier received a unit that he would have to lead. These new levies would gather grass, wood, earth, stone, any kind of material that they possibly could. If any of the captives fell behind during the march to the settlement, the Mongols would execute them. Then when the levies would arrive at the city that was to be attacked, they would fill in the moat or any kind of defensive trenches that had been built quickly with stones and other materials that they carried, thus allowing the Mongols to reach the walls. Mind you, the entire time that this is happening, the defenders on the wall are going to be shooting at them with arrows. They are literally being used as expendable tools in order to destroy any defenses. Captives would also be forced to dig trenches, build any kind of defenses that were needed for the camp. Essentially anything that could be dangerous or deadly, they were going to be the ones that were going to be forced to do it. During a siege, the Mongols would then compel the prisoners to build siege engines, presumably under the direction of Chinese or Persian engineers. And with these engines and their own bows, the Mongols would maintain a kind of constant barrage on the city in order to prevent the enemy from resting and to create fire and spread chaos. And as one Franciscan friar, John de Plano Carpini, would note, they used a rather gruesome fuel at times. According to him, quote, "They even take the fat of the people they kill and, melting it, throw it onto the houses, and wherever the fire falls on this fat, it is almost inextinguishable." And considering how it is that they would treat their prisoners, their supply of fat was near inexhaustible. Prisoners were forced to take an active part in the sieges. They would be the ones that would have to carry the battering rams to the city gates and dig under the enemy walls. If the captives tried to run away, they were put to death. Thus, they had a kind of choice: face certain death at the hands of the Mongols that were controlling them, or probable death at the hands of the defenders that were desperately trying to defend their home. Either way, for the majority, it would not end well for them. And that all being said, the Mongols did realize that it was significantly more efficient if a city went and surrendered before it ever tried to fight in the first place. If they did surrender immediately, then the people inside would be spared, and the city would only have to pay tribute to the Mongols while simultaneously keeping a lot of their local laws and customs. If they did not surrender, then it would be a slaughter. As a consequence of these actions, the Mongols would over time gain a rather notorious reputation for massacres. According to the chroniclers, the Mongols rarely left a living soul whenever they conquered an actual city. Now mind you, that being said, the Mongols were not creatures of absolute wanton bloodlust. They didn't do this out of a desire for blood. Rather, there were a series of reasons as to why they would want to inflict cruelty and terror upon the people. The first of these was to discourage revolts by hostile populations behind the Mongol armies to make sure that their rear was defended. Secondly, as news of the massacres would spread, particularly in cases where the defenders had put up a determined resistance, other cities and peoples that were ahead of them would gradually be intimidated and choose to surrender instead to the Mongols preemptively. Finally, a massacre would serve as a powerful deterrent to any possible rebellion in the settlement after the fact. Still, there would be places where people would rebel, and when that would happen, the Mongols would put it down brutally. As an example of this, under the Seljuk Turks, there was a city called Merv that was full of palaces, libraries, observatories, and canals. It had parks and lush gardens. And all of this came to an end when the messengers of Genghis Khan appeared in 1218. There they demanded tribute and the pick of the city's most beautiful women, and the Seljuks, insulted, refused and killed the messengers. The Mongols would arrive in force 3 years later and demand that the city surrender. When they did, the Mongols then responded to the earlier insult of 3 years previously and massacred the entire city. According to some accounts, each Mongol soldier was ordered to decapitate anywhere between 300 to 400 civilians and to set the city aflame. After the Mongols left, the city of Merv would essentially remain uninhabited for almost a century. In another example, the Mongols would arrive in Herat, Afghanistan in 1221 and capture the city. Unlike before in the case of Merv, initially the inhabitants of Herat were spared. But when they decided to rise up in revolt, Genghis Khan reportedly told one of his generals, "Well, since the dead have come back to life, I command you to strike their heads from their body." Reportedly, by the end, only 40 of the city's 16,000 inhabitants survived. This was, in the end, the fate of many cities across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. But for every one city that was destroyed in such a manner, it was also possible that 10 were spared from such a fate. Terror and cruelty were effectively the bread and butter that fed the ever-expanding and hungry Mongol Empire. But this has been Stakuyi with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. Thank you everyone for watching. I really hope you have a good rest of your day. Please make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know in the comment section below what it is that you thought of this episode and what it is that you would like to see next. I'm always looking for suggestions from you. And again, I appreciate you showing up here today. Don't forget to join Discord, check out my Patreon, and also check out the History podcast down in the links below. I wish you a good rest of your day. Thank you, and goodbye.